In this section, I'm going to think about the vividness of the experience when we focus our attention on something, like a tree or the color red in the examples I gave in the earlier section. So let's use a simple cortical model. Areas defining receptive fields on different levels of complexity within visual inputs, including in this case, there's an area detecting receptive fields a little bit closer to the raw visual inputs. And I've also put in areas defining receptive fields that correspond with different groups of all those visual fields that have temporal correlations in their past activity. And bear in mind that there's always the subcortical structures interpreting receptive field detections into behaviors. And the behaviors generally are releases of detections between cortical areas. So in this architecture, suppose a tree is seen close to the path while out hiking. The visual sensory information will drive direct detection of receptive fields. These receptive fields will have a wide range of recommendation strengths in the basal ganglia, including recommendations in favor of motor movements to avoid walking into the tree, or to speak words like mind the tree. If these types of behaviors have large total recommendation strengths across these receptive fields, but plus other fields that are currently active in other areas, the behavior will be accepted, resulting in release of receptive field detections by the thalamus to drive appropriate motor movements for movement or for speech. But these aren't the only recommendation strengths associated with those receptive fields. Other recommended behaviors can include releases to areas that detect the presence of groups of columns often active at the same time in the past, or groups of columns that expanded their receptive fields at the same time in the past. If those behaviors are selected, they implement indirect activations of currently inactive columns, some in the same visual areas, on the basis that they were active in the past at similar times to currently detected columns. So you'll get an expanded population of active columns, supported at different phases of frequency modulation and occurring across multiple cortical areas. These expanded populations can have recommendation strengths, perhaps in favor of release of the enhanced total activity in one area to the next area. And that will drive yet more column activations in that area. And there could be lots of possible routes to enhance the overall indirectly activated column population. So let's think about the contents of that currently activated population. It's made up of columns that were active at similar times in the past to the directly detected tree columns. So if in the past, let's say you've seen a tree house at the same time as a tree, the population might include a small proportion of the columns active when you were looking at the tree house. It might include some of the columns active when looking at a bird sitting in a tree. And of course, some of the columns directly activated might be columns also active when looking at objects with some degree of similarity to trees, like telegraph poles, for example. So the population will include fragments of lots of past populations that were active in response to objects similar to or present at the same time as trees. And then, if we think about the columns active at the group of objects level of discrimination, there could be fragments of the population active when you climbed a tree in the past, or when you looked at autumn colours, or cut down a tree, or sat with a friend under a tree, or watched some activity around a tree, and so on. So there may be fragments of the populations active in the past in response to many different situations in which trees featured, and of course at more levels of complexity than I've actually illustrated. Now, although there are fragments of lots of different past populations, no one of these populations will be predominant. For example, there won't be a predominant recommendation strength in favor of, say, naming one object rather than another, or describing one situation rather than another. So, the much greater active column population will be experienced as being much more vivid, but it won't be possible to describe the enhanced population in detail, because no one fragment will have sufficient recommendation strength in favor of speech behavior. However, the fragments also have indirect activation recommendation strengths. And if one fragment has slightly more total recommendation strength than others in favor of indirect activation of yet other columns active in the past at the same time in a consistent manner, further stages of indirect activation might lead to a population approximating to one past experience, with a predominant recommendation strength in favor of describing that experience. In other words, an episodic memory retrieval. So the broad indirect activation could lead, with a few more stages, to a more specific activation. The behavioral value of the broad activation is therefore that it provides access to a wide range of possibly relevant recommendation strengths, which can be evolved to generate an appropriate behavior. For example, on a hike with companions, the process could lead to conversation about related past experiences. And even for relatively abstract experiences, like the color red, columns directly detected within the perception of a color will all have recommendation strengths in favor of indirect activation of other columns. And as before, the secondary population results in a subjective experience of richer mental activity. But because it contains only fragments of many past populations, like looking at a red balloon, seeing a woman in a red dress, drinking red wine at a party, and so on, none of the fragments are going to be large enough to generate accepted recommendations like episodic recollections. So again, there's the subjective experience of richer mental activity, but it can't be described in detail. Now note that if you compare two brains, the number of areas and the rough complexity of receptive fields in each area are defined genetically, so they'll be the same. But the number of columns in the corresponding areas may differ, and all the column receptive fields are defined heuristically from experience, so they'll be different between different brains. In other words, there generally won't be a correspondence between a receptive field in one brain and a receptive field in another brain. So the columns directly activated in response to, say, the color red, the pattern of activation of columns will be completely different in the two brains. And although in each brain a particular group of columns will tend to be active more often when the color red is seen, the groups won't correspond. So since the columns don't correspond, the experience of each brain is completely different at the anatomical level of description. Because the column receptive fields are different and the past experiences of the two brains are different, columns in areas detecting groups of columns active at the same time in the past will also be completely different. So there's not going to be any correspondence at the individual column level between the populations indirectly activated in response to the color red in the two brains. In other words, at the level of columns and neurons, the experience of each brain is unique. And furthermore, the actual columns that are indirectly activated will be those most strongly recommended across the complete current population of active columns. That population includes columns in much higher areas corresponding with the complex circumstances currently present. And those columns will probably be different each time attention is paid to the color red. So the population indirectly activated in response to paying attention to the color red probably won't be the same on different occasions, even for the same brain.